In this episode of The Art of Boat Building, I'm going to show you how to make a perfect epoxy fillet. We're going to start putting out the glass cloth and also get the epoxy resin on the boat. In addition to that, I'm going to get the skeg installed and get a couple of coats of primer on the boat. And stick around to the end and I'll show you what we're going to do with this new tiller. All of that's coming up in this episode of The Art of Boat Building. Last week we ended with me talking about needing to add some fillets. So let me show you how I added these perfect fillets. Began by mixing up a batch of epoxy and adding wood flour as a filler. The goal is to get a consistency equal to peanut butter. Once it was thoroughly mixed, I then put it into a pastry bag. I then cut off the end so that I could pipe out a consistent 1/4 inch bead. Since I'm right-handed, I worked from left to right. I used the rounded end of a tongue depressor as a filleting tool. I was very careful to keep the angle the same. If you change the angle, you get an inconsistent fillet. I sharpened the other end of the tongue depressor to a chisel point, and I used that to remove the residue. I cut some strips of peel ply release film and laid it over the fillet. I used my fingers to smooth it down, feeling for any inconsistencies. I gave it a final inspection and then let it cure overnight. Well, it's the next morning and now we can pull the peel ply off of the fillets here. And it's just a matter of taking a hold of it and pulling it right off. You can see it leaves just a beautiful fillet on there. Many of you have seen me use this styrofoam as a sanding block. What I did was I took a piece and I sanded it down so that I had a nice fillet on each corner of the block. And then I applied this self-adhesive 80 grit sandpaper. Now if you see, once you've got this, and I've got that fillet in there, it's very easy then just to take a few strokes and you've got it sanded. Well, now that the hull is all nice and fair, we can get started putting some glass cloth on it. My friend and boat building colleague, Pat Cahill, stopped by to give me a hand putting on the glass cloth. Extra hands are always helpful in this operation.
It's okay.
Okay, we've got the hull all cleared out, and we've got it vacuumed, and also got it all wiped down with acetone. So our next step now is to get the glass cloth out and get it laid under the hull. The process we'll be using is to put the glass cloth on the dry hull and then saturate the cloth with epoxy. The other method is to lay down a coat of epoxy and then the cloth. The issue with that method is it's nearly impossible to get the cloth to lay down smooth. The concern with cloth first is that the wood would absorb the epoxy and starve the glass cloth. However, with multiple batches of epoxy and keeping a close eye, more epoxy can be added as the base coat starts to set. This is the best method for this type of hull.
See, I saw you put those scissors back there. Okay. This is where extra hands are very handy. Yeah, the whole thing needs to slide down this way. A little more than that. Okay.
So we're going to get ready to put the resin on, and I'm using Total Boat's high performance epoxy and the slow hardener. That way it'll give me a little more time, working time. Now the high performance is a 2-to-1 mix. Now it comes with these pumps that this would be for the hardener and this would be for the resin. The problem with that in the amount that I'm mixing is there'd be a lot of pumping. So what we're going to do is mix it directly into these mixing cups. These mixing cups are really easy to use. You can see over here, if I go to the 2-to-1 spot, what we do, so the first left side here is for the resin. So you'd fill it up to 2 with resin, and then you'd fill up the rest of it to 2 with the hardener. I've calculated that I need probably about a pint or so. So I'm going to fill it to the 3 with resin and then to the 3 with hardener. I'm going to mark these with a magic marker so that it's a little easier to discover where I want to go to.
You already did those.
I know. And now let's get this mixed. And the rule of thumb is to mix for 2 minutes. Okay, that's been 2 minutes. And the trick is to get it into your tray as soon as possible. The sooner you get it a bigger surface like this, the less apt it's going to go off on you. But if it sits in the container, it easily can, the volume being more condensed will make it want to go off quicker. Okay, we'll go over and get started. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start in the middle here, work from the top down, and then work fore and aft. So one of the reasons you start in the middle is that the glass wants to stretch a little bit. So you want it to stretch to the two ends.
Got a big spot right up here. So Pat and I are working on probably the most trickiest part, I would say, up here at the bow. And this is where extra hands is always helpful. But one of the things you can do is you can kind of move the roller and stretch the fabric a little bit also. I think we're going to need a little bit more, Pat.
All right, a couple ounces.
Yep. Well, I did actually get it all down. All right, now that I've got it all on here, what I need to do is go over and just make sure that I don't have any areas pooling or not enough epoxy.
Yes or no?
Yes, dump it in there. I see some spots that are dried out.
I'm real happy with the way this is grabbed into the keel here.
Yeah, came in good, didn't it?
I don't see a bubble.
Well, I think we've got it pretty well coated. It looks pretty uniform, so we're going to wait for a couple of hours, let this kick off, and then we'll get putting the last two coats on it.
In the second coat, I added some micro balloon fillers to the epoxy. It all went on very fine. However, I did learn a few things that I was able to apply to the third coat. After the second coat set, I took this opportunity to trim off some of the excess fiberglass. Glass microballoons are low-density microscopic particles made of sodium borsilicate. These are hollow glass spheres that can be added and mixed into epoxy to thicken and extend without adding weight. They create a lightweight, sandable compound ideal for fairing. I learned several things when I used them for the third coat. The first was the proper mixing ratio. They should be mixed at a ratio of 2:1. So by volume, they should be 50% of the amount of resin by volume. So I used 12 ounces of mixed resin with 6 ounces of micro balloons. The second thing I discovered was it was much easier to mix the resin into the micro balloons as opposed to the other way around. This method kept the particles from becoming airborne, and also you were able to mix the whole amount at one time. Well, the other thing that I discovered was that using a nap roller instead of a foam roller, the material was much easier to spread evenly. Now I'm using a 3/16 inch mohair nap roller for this, and the mohair roller was designed for epoxy and varnish. Now the only downside to this is that the roller left a little bit more of a texture on the surface. This is easily remedied by using a foam brush that I went by and tipped it. The epoxy has had a couple of days to cure now, and you can see that the surface came out really nice. So now the next step is to sand it with 80 grit sandpaper.
Well, it sands really nicely. It doesn't take much effort at all. Yeah, so anyway, we'll get going. Well, I'm on day 2 of sanding. I got the port side all sanded yesterday, and today I've been working over here on the starboard side. There's a couple of observations that I wanted to share. One was that I initially had said that I had let it cure for 48 hours, which I did. Now that was on the conservative side of the epoxy curing. It was generally, they say, between 2 days to 3 days for it to fully cure. So now this side has been more than 3 days that it's cured, and it sands just a little bit easier. What I mean by that is that it seems that the paper doesn't wear out quite as fast, and it seems that it's just a little smoother. Now the other thing that I've noticed is that it sands so much easier than just straight epoxy. So those micro balloons in there really have made the epoxy an easier surface to sand. Epoxy itself is actually very hard. So by putting those micro balloons in there, it really helps it to be able to be sanded easily. It also doesn't gum up as fast as when you're sanding epoxy that's just straight. So all in all, I think it's well worth the time to use those micro balloons in the hull. Now, one of the things that I noticed was in sanding, I do what I call cross-hatching. I'm going to demonstrate with this small block, but basically it's going on a diagonal one way, and then back the other way. And that cross-hatching, it cuts faster than if you were just to all go one direction. So you can see how quickly, and then if I take my longboard and go over that, it really doesn't take very long at all to, you can see that's, I don't know what that is, 5 by 7, something like that, square inches, and that literally only took half a minute or so. So I'm going to continue to sand and get it all finished up. While I was working on the hull, I also put 3 coats of epoxy on the skeg. And now that I've got the skeg all fitted in there, some of you had asked in the last episode what that slot was for, and so that's what it's for, is for that skeg to fit in there. Now the fits in there pretty tightly. You can see it hardly wiggles at all, but what I'll do next is I will fill this with some thickened epoxy and then put it in there, and once that's all set, then we'll run a epoxy fillet along the side. Well, now that the boat is all sanded properly and I've got it all cleaned down, now the next thing that I'm going to do is to get ready to start putting primer on it. And before I do that, I want to put a strip of tape along the shear here so that when I attach the outwale, it will have an epoxy surface to glue to instead of having that primer go between the outwale and the hull. So we'll get started putting on this tape. For the primer, I'm going to use Total Protect, which is a 3-to-1 mixture, which is an epoxy-based primer. So as before, we're going to use one of these mixing cups, and since it's 3:1, then we go over here to the 3:1 marking. I've figured out that basically I need a little more than 16 ounces. So if I go up to the 3 here with the base and then 3 here for the curing agent, then I will have about 20 ounces of material. So let's get it mixed. It's really important to get it mixed properly. You can see at the bottom of the can here, it's pretty thick. So I'm going to take several minutes here and get it all mixed thoroughly. That looks pretty good. Now we'll get the curing agent stirred up. And we'll give that a thorough mixing. And I think, like epoxy, that I will give it a 2-minute stir here. Well, that's it for the first coat. I'm going to ultimately put 2 coats of the barrier primer on, but one of the things about getting this primer on there is you can really see if your hull was not fair or not, and I'm happy to say I'm pretty happy with the way that it all looks. So we'll let this all cure and then I'll get a second coat on it. Well, I've got 2 coats of the barrier coat primer on the hull now, and I think it's now all ready to get some final paint, which is what we'll do next. Now, a couple of weeks ago, Steve was given a tiller by someone, so he sent it to me, and it turns out the tiller is almost exactly the right size for Victoria. It articulates like this. So the challenge will be is to figure out a retractable rudder with this tiller. So all of that will be coming up in the next episode. So as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you the next time on the Art of Boat Building. Now, how am I going to make this work? That is definitely going to be a challenge.